Hey there neighbors, Kevin here with eTrailer, and today we're going to be taking a look at and showing you how to install the Roadmaster rear anti-sway bar here on our 2019 Holiday Rambler Admiral Class A motorhome. If you own a Class A motorhome, you know sway is an unfortunate side effect of just how large and un-aerodynamic the body of your motorhome is. So there's a few ways that you can help deal with that issue so that you can have a much more comfortable ride quality. First one being an anti-sway bar, which is exactly what we're going to be talking about today. Now, in most cases, your rear suspension doesn't always have that on a lot of the older style motorhomes, but I am noticing a lot of the newer ones, kind of 2018 and up, are really starting to have one already on there from the factory, but manufacturers like Roadmaster, which we installed today, are adding on an extra one, so that way you get a little bit more support. So typically you're going to have one on either end of your rear differential, and Roadmaster is going to be giving you that extra that you can add on. And what this does is it's essentially a spring that wants to retain its shape. So it can give a little bit of bend as it moves, as your suspension kind of compresses and decompresses and the body sways side to side. And what it wants to do is always retain that shape. So when we start to lean to one side, which on this motorhome we do lean a lot to our driver's side because there is a slide out that is pretty much the entire length of that. And typically when you have a slide out, there's a lot more reinforcement, which means a whole lot more weight is going to be over on that side. When I was actually in there and getting the rear brackets on, I actually got stuck for a little bit in the wheel well. On the other side, I had plenty of open space. So that kind of tells me that we do have way more weight over there. And what that's going to do is want to constantly lean that way, and then whenever we're hitting some kind of bump in the road, now we're swaying side to side. And what that anti-sway bar is going to do is try to pull your frame rails back to where they're just parallel between each other and they're not starting to lift up away from what they should be sitting at. So when it comes to the installation, with this one, you are going to need to get yourself a little bit of space between the frame rail and then your leaf spring. So the leaf spring right now kind of blocks a little bit of the frame rail, and there's two bolts because there's a cross member that runs between there. And we need to get those two lower bolts out. So the way that we do that is lift up by the frame. So we're lifting up at the frame rail at the back to gain that extra bit of clearance so we can pop those two bolts out. In this case, you probably would want a decent sized impact so that way you can really kind of bust all the nuts loose and be able to add on your new hardware and get everything in place nice and tight. So for that, and just because of the leveling issue here where you're now lifting up by the frame, this might be one that you don't really want to do at home. So for that reason, I highly recommend reaching out to our dealer network using our dealer locator, and all you have to do is just enter in your zip code and you can find a shop near you to get it professionally installed. Now if you are wanting to do this yourself, you're ready to tackle the job, and then please feel free to stick around and I'll walk you through the process. So to start off our install, what I've done so far is I've jacked up the back of our motorhome by the frame, so that way we get a little bit more space between our suspension and our frame rail here, because the first step of this is installing the frame brackets for our end links, and that's going to require removing two bolts that are attached at the cross member right behind our rear wheels here. So getting those two out, the leaf springs are in the way, so jacking the frame up gets you to where the bolts will now be a little bit above the leaf spring pack. That way you can get them out and get that bracket in place. Very, very tight, so we've got a little GoPro in there, and that's going to capture me getting those two out so you guys can see this at home. I've got an extremely long extension so that way I can make it in there. If I cannot get it to come off, then that's where we will have to get a little bit more in depth with this. If you find that yours is really rusted on there or corroded on real bad, definitely hit it with some penetrating oil, maybe let it sit for a little bit before you try to get it out. But what I've had to do in the past is, if we can't get this through the side here, what I've done is gone under the motorhome, and then I'll use a wrench and I'll put a pipe on the end of it, so that way I've got a lot more leverage. Then we can typically break it free and then use a ratcheting wrench to get it off the rest of the way to speed it up. So with all that being said, I'm going to get in there and get these two bolts out, and we'll show you how we do it. So here's one of the nuts on the inside of our frame rail. It's got a little retainer clip here, and that just essentially is going to stop once it hits the frame rail and prevent that from continuing to spin on you, so it's going to act essentially the same as a weld nut. Now, I've got the other one I still got to get off. It's further back, so the angle of our leaf spring pack is kind of fighting it a little bit more. Even with a short well socket, I can't really get it in there all the way to get it fully off without the socket backing up so far that it's now touching the leaf spring pack. So I'm gonna get under there, and I'll probably need to use a wrench. I forgot to say before this, but I am using a 21mm socket to get these bolts out. So here's the bracket we're going to be slotting into that place, and those two bolts we just removed are going to be going right back through here through these two holes. So this is going to go on the outside of the frame rail and just butt right up into that space. We'll put those two bolts and those nuts with the retention clips on there, and we'll tighten those back down and then torque them as well to the factory spec. So for our next step, we're going to be disconnecting the shocks. So we're going to be taking this bolt out, and you're going to need a 1 1/8 inch socket and wrench, because we're going to be putting our mount, our D-shape mount, which I got down below, right on the back side of our shock mount. And to get our hardware in, we need to remove the shock just because there's just not enough clearance for it. Pop out the bolt, set that aside. We can drop this back just a little bit. Now, we got two sets of hardware. We're going to have a black button head screw, and then there's going to be a flat washer with a cut on it, so it's more of a D shape. That's going to go together because that's going to be closer to our shock. So when you put this into that shock mount, you want to have the flat side facing down towards the bottom, so that way it gives a little bit more clearance for that shock to go back up into place. For the top hole, we're just going to go with that zinc finish hardware here, and we'll throw a flat washer on that too. So at this point now we can lube up our bushings. We're going to have this green lubrication that we'll take about half out of for each bushing, and we'll rub that all on the inside of the bushing. All right, so I have my anti-sway bar oriented the way it's going to sit. So we have the Roadmaster sticker to where it's facing towards the rear of the motorhome, and it's facing, the right way. It's not upside down. You can see with that flat against the ground, the end of the bar is sticking up a little bit more. So when we go to put these on, it's going to be bracketed on this way. So we want to make sure that we're popping it on that same way. That way you're not getting grease or lubrication everywhere. Highly recommend gloves anytime you're touching that, just because this stuff kind of gets everywhere. But we'll split these open, pop them on, and then we'll be ready to hold our bar up in place and get those D-shaped mounting brackets onto those bolts that we put in the shock mount. Now with an extra set of hands, we are going to slap on that D-shaped bracket and then lift our anti-sway bar into place. You may have to kind of shuffle it side to side to really center it here. But once you have it that way, we'll then throw on that D-shaped flat washer onto that button head screw. Throw on a mechanical lock nut. And then up top, we got another flat washer and lock nut. We'll do the same thing over on the other side. All right, I'm going to snug down my hardware for the top bolt. That's going to be a 9/16 socket on both the head of the bolt and on the nut. On the bottom, with that button head screw, it'll be a 9/16 socket on the nut, but on the bolt head side, we're going to be using a 5.5mm hex bit. I did have to move the shock a bit more out of the way at the bottom here. It is going to fight you the whole time you're trying to do this. All right, once you have your hardware snugged down, then you can come back with your torque wrench and torque it to spec. Now we can reinstall our shocks. This is going to be a little bit of a fight here. Just lining it up just perfect because we also are kind of really tight on that clearance with that button head bolt. So you may have to kind of play around with it a bit. So one thing you should probably do before you torque the stuff down, unlike I did, is just double check to make sure that you can still get that bolt through on your shock. It's 50-50 shot that it's going to work with that washer on the bolt head side of the button head screw. In our case, it didn't. We were off just that amount to get the shock back in line with the mount. So I did have to remove that, and then I just took the washer off the bolt head side. We still have the washer on the nut side, and pop that back in. I'm about to torque that right back down, and then we can stick our bolt back through and snug that down and torque it as well. All right, so at this point now we are going to hang up our end links, and we kind of need to play around with it a little bit because the goal here is to have this as perpendicular, so straight up and down as we can from our frame rail. And we've got 2 slots we can go through, and then we have 3 slots down at the bottom where it's actually going to connect to our sway bar. So if I lift that up, I also want to have my sway bar be as level as I can. So realistically, I need to kind of be right about there. So we potentially could use the bottom hole here and then the very top hole here, but then that leaves our end link bracket sitting pretty low. So I'm going to just go ahead and I'm going to try the top, and we'll get see what kind of works from there. So I'll pop in one of our bolts to help hold it in place, and then we can see what slot's going to look the best. First one's not too bad. That's pretty level. I think I might go for the middle though. That's kind of just a little bit higher up, gives us a little bit more ground clearance. And we are still staying nice and straight, so we'll pop that in. And we'll do the same over on the other side. Then we can throw on our lock nuts, and we will tighten and torque those down to spec as well. So while you're tightening this down, we don't want to go too tight. This is a pretty low torque just because this bar still has to kind of glide back and forth as our suspension compresses and decompresses. So I would just get it down to snug and then come back with your torque wrench to make sure you don't accidentally over tighten it. And for that bolt and nut, we're using 15/16 sockets. You could also use a wrench, obviously, but I just had 2 of these close by. So I'm going to snug each one of these down, and then, like I said, we'll come back with that torque wrench. Once you have those torqued down to spec, that's going to do it for the install portion of this. At this point now, what you should do is go out, test drive it a little bit, come back, double check that all of your bolts stayed torqued to their specific settings, and then from there on, it's just kind of routine maintenance. So just give it a once over, maybe before you go out on your trip. Especially if you're someone who doesn't go too often, it'd be good to check it every single time. If you're someone who's out every single day, maybe you live in your RV, maybe once a month at least, go out, just check your bushings, make sure each one of those is still in decent shape, and then just check those torque settings, make sure nothing potentially backed out and got a little bit loose. And that's honestly all that there is to it when it comes to the maintenance on these sway bars. That's going to do it for our look at and installation of the Roadmaster rear anti-sway bar here on our 2019 Holiday Rambler Admiral Class A motorhome. My name's Kevin, and if you still have some questions about what's going to be the right suspension upgrade for your Class A motorhome, please feel free to reach out to us via our Ask the Experts link, a comment on this video, or a phone call to our customer service department, and we'd be happy to help you out on your journey.